Good morning, everybody. And I am also glad, on behalf of myself and also my government, to welcome all in Tallinn Digital Summit. And in this panel on technology governance, we will actually talk about how to make all these things happen that were actually talked about in the morning. How to make sure that we do not lose our economic advantage, that we are still innovative, how we keep up with technological trends, but how we also make sure that at the same time our security is preserved, our human rights are followed, our privacy is taken care of, and so forth. We will have 45 minutes, which would mean a little delayed lunch for you, but I am pretty sure our panel will compensate this and even beyond. But to give a little bit of the background, what we will talk about today with our great panelists, I will introduce all of them later individually, is something that has not reached perhaps everybody. And I'm not going to make a test to see how many of you know or think they know what global technology governance is, but I'm glad that this discussion happens here in Estonia and in Tallinn Digital Summit. Because Estonia is one of these countries, and I would say that it could be a reminder that technology can bring good. We have our lives much easier, we can have services online, we can vote online, and so forth. We have transparency, we have increased trust, we have become one of the more open and democratic countries in the world with a strong economy. But at the same time, increasingly, we are actually worried. We are worried because these technologies, even if they are meant to be for something good, for example, curing cancer, can actually be used against us. And this can have severe impacts on how our democracies function, it has an impact on our security, and so forth. So what has been increasingly, let's say, in the focus around the governments, and I believe we don't maybe even have to ask whether we now agree on this or not, because largely we agree that we need to find some global governance models, how to guarantee this balance. And I would say that this area is getting rather crowded. We have quite a bit of initiatives going on, several processes are ongoing around data governance, data sharing. Japan initiated free data flows initiative to, I would say, support global sharing of data. We have currently UN Digital Global Process ongoing, aiming by the 2024 to reach on principles that we would all adhere to in our digital development and cooperation. In the morning, you heard quite a bit of the approach EU has taken. It's a very regulatory approach. EU recently put forward AI Act, we have Digital Services Act, and so many other pieces of legislation that do serve also a paved way for regulating these very fast technological changes. But it's not all as easy. As we also heard this morning, private sector has more power than ever. They are, in a way, more powerful than nation states. They have a lot more knowledge than nation states. There is quite a bit of geopolitics around technological innovation. We heard about US, China, and all these things that we are very well aware of. And how now in this setting make sure that we come to a global agreement on a good technology governance. I do not know whether we will develop it in this session, but definitely we will be one step closer. So I'm not going to take any more time. I would actually like to start with Urs Kasse, who is currently a professor on public policy governance and innovation technology, and has a very good overview of what has happened and what is happening, also serving as the director for the Berkman Klein Center for Internet at Harvard University. So, Urs, do you think good governance model taking into consideration everything that is happening is possible? And what do you think it could be?
Thank you very much for having me. Easy question to begin with. The first thing I would point out is really that as a society, as citizens, as private actors and governments, we're in a learning process. We have seen, of course, an unprecedented wave of technological development. Everyone is talking right now about generative AI, but that's only, I think, the tip of the iceberg of what we've seen in terms of rapid cycles of tech innovation over the past few decades. And there is no secret that we have probably made less progress in innovating on what good governance means. We are still largely operating in a system, in a governance system that is using laws and regulations, but also other forms of norms like ethical principles or professional good practices at all levels, from global to very local, that date back quite a while, sometimes even century, if you look at how states operate. And so the question is a serious one, not only how to govern new technologies that have different characteristics and disruptive effects and all that, but also what good governance means in such a changing world with large global challenges that we've heard about earlier today in this stage. Now, so there's not the complicating factor is good governance is a moving target. I don't think we have a shared global agreement what good governance means. We may agree on some principles. So governance has to do with accountability, it has to do with transparency, with legitimacy, but all of these dimensions are, of course, defined differently depending on cultures and traditions and the like. So it's a really hard problem to sort out. If I'm asked what would be my definition of good governance, I would perhaps put forward as a working draft that good governance is a system of guardrails, so different norms at different levels by different stakeholders that let us, both individually and collectively, make good decisions by embracing human agency, but also linking our human capacity and responsibility to the social good. We heard before from Secretary General during Bogdan about the SDGs, and that may be a framework where we can benchmark good governance towards when it comes to these societal levels. So unfortunately, not a short or easy answer, but again, just be aware how long it has taken us to develop good governance, and some argue it has failed, for the industrial age. And now, on a very compressed period of time, we're expecting to sort out good governance for a whole range of technologies, all the way from digital to AI, and quantum was mentioned. It will take time to figure out both the governance piece and what good means.
Yes, thank you. I completely agree. I think we are still discussing what good governance is, and for those who perhaps do not know, there is also Open Government Partnership Initiative, which is actually one of these instruments that is looking at the ways to direct this technological development to improve our democracy and all the other good things. But Minister Josephine, if I may, Singapore is one of the other leading digital nations, and we are always looking at what you are doing. Maybe you can also reflect a bit on and follow up on Ursi's statement. So, and let us know how Singapore has tackled these issues, how it has guaranteed a good governance, whereas also promoting digital innovation, and what do you have for the future?
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador. I would firstly say that Singapore was very inspired by Estonia in our own digital development, and many of the ideas build on those that we observed that Estonia had implemented very successfully. I would say that, as in all things, we always try to begin with the end in mind. So when we ask ourselves the questions, what constitutes good digital governance? It first has to tie in with the aims that this governance is intended to achieve. And so when Singapore thinks about digital governance, the aims that we are trying to achieve are essentially in terms of expanding opportunities for our people and our businesses. It is also in terms of promoting a sense of trust and safety when people engage digitally. And thirdly, equally importantly, it's about how you strengthen a sense of solidarity in society. So even though we live in the analog physical world, the digital developments must try to contribute towards this strengthening of community. So those are the broad aims of digital governance. Now, how do we then try to fulfill these aims? Essentially, I would say that there are 5 buckets of strategies that we pursue. The first is that you really have to invest in infrastructure. There's no running away from it. Secondly, there is also a lot of work to be done in capability development. The capabilities can be in terms of what the enterprises are able to do in order to benefit from digitalization, but it's also in terms of what the workforce is able to do in order to participate meaningfully in the new jobs that are being created, in the use of digital tools that they can become more productive in their existing work. So capability development is a very important aspect of good digital governance too. I think there are also 3 other things. One is, how do we promote a whole of society involvement? Meaning to say that it's not just government that can take action. Bringing in the private sector, bringing in the people sector, that's also very useful. In some areas, the research community, academia, can make a definite contribution. So a whole of society approach, I think, is helpful in good digital governance. I think there's also no running away from the 4th important area, which is updating our laws and regulations. I think there was also the comment that, we struggle to keep up. The developments are happening at such a fast pace, it's so accelerated. Those of us in policy making are sometimes, left wondering, what do we do in order to get a firmer grasp? And what kinds of guardrails are we able to put in place adequately and in a timely manner? So updating laws and regulations are another essential part of good digital governance. And fifthly, I think today's meeting is a very good example of how we need international cooperation too. And the international cooperation recognizes the fact that digital is very borderless, and many of the digital services that we interact with, our citizens interact with, they are global products and services. And it's very difficult for individual countries alone to try and put in place the governance framework without also considering the interoperability of rules and principles, systems and standards. So how through international governance, international cooperation, we can bring about a convergence rather than a divergence. I think that can also help to build up to good digital governance. So those are the kinds of things that we think about.
You mentioned also regulation, and we heard quite a bit of the EU's approach to regulation, and you have a bit shared Singapore's approach, but what do you expect, let's say, from technology regulations attempting to regulate these very fast-moving targets in a way?
Well, first, I'd say that regulations are only one part of governance. If you really want to achieve, objectives like maximizing opportunities, you've got to look at other things too. But having said that, I think when we try to introduce new laws or update existing laws and introduce regulations, in the digital domain, we've found it much more necessary to engage with the companies that are behind the products and services that will be impacted by the regulations. And building a sort of relationship that is both firm, clear about our governance objectives, and yet able to take into consideration the constraints that the businesses may themselves encounter, as well as bringing them on board, getting them to contribute to solutioning. I think that's the general approach that we try to take. There is a need for us to master the technology, to understand it deeply. On the other hand, there is also a need for us to recognize that we don't know entirely the deepest aspects of how it works. And so bringing on board the developers of those systems and getting them involved in the conversation in developing the solutions, I think is very much an important attitude to have.
Thank you. We have a private sector also here. Florian Breger is vice president at the IBM. So how does it seem to you? Do you feel first that you have been involved and adequately involved in all these developments that have taken place? And what is your take on it? Do you see they would work? Do you see the impact of the AI Act for the EU? Yes. We do not yet, of course, know entirely how it is going to be implemented. Some countries have already announced some developments, like Spain recently and so forth. But could you give your view on it, holding quite a bit of information and power in this field?
Thank you. First, thank you for having me here. And thanks to the audience who choose to stay with us here despite of the lunch. And food for thought will feed you longer than calories. And thanks to the organizers, because this is one of the most or the best events I've been to in a long time. And I think what you have here is already one of these governances, because we share our insights and our thoughts on that. So as an industry guy, I would say for global technology and regulation, it's important that you don't stifle innovation, that you don't hinder innovation. It must happen. Where you have access to data, where you have access to technology, where your investments are safeguarded, you as an industry will invest. You will bring your people, this will lead to prosperity. And I think we agree on that. Overregulation, when we see these hype cycles, like now we are facing generative AI, and people might fear that now it's time really to regulate. I would say calm down, look to all the laws that we already have, that are in place, and that we can use already. That's helpful. Yeah? I think we have to come to not a technology regulation in itself, but a use case and risk-based assessment of what we want to regulate, the outcome. Yeah? I think that's important. And that was really inspiring what Josephine just said, that's having the foresight of what you want to achieve. I think that's so complicated for many governments, because with this rapid speed of innovation, when I was a child, government drove innovations, yeah? From GPS to flying to the moon, it was mainly coming from governments. In these days, you see self-landing rockets, and then afterwards governments think about, hey, what do we do with this? Yeah? And so we as industry, we overwhelm them with all these new features. So it's our obligation to explain what can you do with this. And that's why we contribute in this conversation. That's why we embrace the chance to talk about the AI Act, for example, and have our own position. We as IBM, we're 112 years old, and I think our technologies have changed fundamentally. We helped to fly to the moon. Now we're to explore the macrocosmos. Now we go to the microcosmos with a quantum computer and AI. But our values have always stayed the same. Yeah? Make meaningful innovations, help our clients to succeed, but be trustworthy in all relations. And I think that's important, and that's how regulation should be to work on the long run. So have the foresight, be trustworthy, be explainable.
Yeah, but we have had these few examples on, I would say, very long legislative process. So how do you, from industry, believe? We started with the preparations of the AI Act several years back. Now, soon, 1 year, we will be discussing what else to do now with the generative AI emergence and so forth. Do you see this feasible, or let's say then enough?
Well, look, I would say it's good, and sometimes it takes time. I would say if you're a government in Europe and would say we don't do anything till it's ready, I would say the train left the station, and if you missed the opportunity, yeah. So you should start doing something now with having the upcoming regulation in mind. Yeah, that's what I see. Especially that's what I see in all is. To regulate, you have to understand the technologies. So you have to create spaces where you can experiment with this. Yeah, and that's what we see, whether it's in Singapore, Japan, the US. There's an openness to enable societies, governments, and others to explore the potential of technologies. Yeah? That's important. And then you can wait for the right regulation.
Thank you, Florian, and I will get back to you in a bit. But we have seen very different approaches to regulation. EU has very heavily invested on it. Some countries are somewhere in between, UK and so forth. Some countries have not yet stepped on it. At the same time, it's a global issue, and in order to have some impact, we would, in a way, have to globally agree on some fundamental principles. And I'm glad that Amandep Gill, who is UN Tech Envoy, and is in charge of a very important process called Global Digital Compact process, that aims to globally now manage these countries, but also other partners who have different interests, who are at very different levels in their digital development, and so forth. So what can you say about the process until now, Amandep? Where do you see hopes, and what can we actually perhaps expect from the result of this long process? The midterm report from the co-facilitators, Sweden and Rwanda, came out on the 1st of September. I believe it's a very well wrapped up, I would say, status quo, but you know this process in and out, so what would you say?
Right. Thank you, Nele. It's a pleasure to be back at the Tallinn Digital Summit. I was last here in 2021. It's always very refreshing, great to meet you all. And before we dive into the details of what's happening next year, I just wanted to say that global governance of technology is not a new idea. It's been around since technology has started impacting our societies in this manner. So at least back to the 19th century. Doreen spoke before us, and the ITU has been allocating radio spectrum, has been allocating satellite slots. Many other international organizations have sprung up to manage the impact of technology in specific areas: civil aviation, the maritime domain, the telecommunications domain. And the idea behind that is very simple, that you have to manage certain resources as global commons so that you have the greater good for the greatest number of people. And these days, increasingly, it's not just people, it's also the planet. Sometimes our individual incentives, whether we are a nation state or a company, are such that we may not care, or incentives are such that we may not bother about the greater good. So you have this fundamental critical role for global governance, global coordination at least. Even if it's not regulatory responses, at least interoperability, coordination, learning from each other, understanding different approaches so that there is smoothness in terms of business operations, diplomacy, and so on. Now, coming to your point about where are we on digital governance globally today, there is this important process, the Global Digital Compact, as part of the Summit of the Future next year, September. First phase of consultations, listening in widely, that's over. Now, next phase, negotiations would begin early next year. And hopefully a comprehensive charter, not just of principles, but shared objectives, commitments, actions, apply to different stakeholders would emerge out of that, which gives us a common hymn sheet as technology accelerates and as different nations go about maximizing their own benefits, and as private sector moves on to develop innovation and put products and services in the marketplace. And this hopefully would be adopted by both governments and the private sector. And there is another dimension to it, which is a kind of a test case for global governance of technology, say, and that is artificial intelligence. So today we are at a stage where the Secretary General has called for an advisory body on AI governance. It is being put together right now, and it will have its interim report out by the end of the year and a final report by next summer, so that we can look at various options for global governance. All those historic examples, whether it's ICAO, IMO, IPCC, and others. I'm sorry, I don't have, shouldn't choose all these acronyms. But what do we learn from them? Or the International Atomic Energy Agency. There's no simple cut and paste, but there are some lessons. How do we reflect on them in the current context? What should be the international governance approach? And tailored to risks, as colleagues were saying, because you don't want to stifle innovation, and be agile in terms of our governance responses, and also connected to the industry level. So there is the international tier, there's the national, regional, regulatory tier, and there's the industry level governance in terms of codes of conduct, standards, the kind of work that IEEE and other standards development organizations do. Today, the challenge is, unlike the 20th century or the 19th century, all these levels have to work in an agile fashion, in a coordinated fashion for the benefit of people and planet.
Can I jump in to add on what Amandeep has said? Because I think he triggered something in my mind that hopefully will help us to think about global digital governance in a robust way. Amandeep talked about the international organizations that have been effective, successful. And he suggested that we look at what has made them effective. And this is also a question that Singapore has been asking itself. As a small country, we've benefited greatly from a rules-based international order. And international organizations are very much a part of it. So we have been keen supporters and active participants in IMO, ICAO, ILO, even the IAEA. And we don't use nuclear, but we have to understand how it works. In looking at several of these organizations, we could perhaps identify a few key themes. One of it is that these organizations have clear mandates. And the clear mandates come from the fact that there are internationally recognized agreements, conventions, that took time to put in place. So if you look at the IMO has at least 20 conventions that sits beneath it. And these conventions could be, for example, safety of life at sea, something as basic as that, or environmental requirements for shipping. So the mandate is clear, and it comes from these international recognized conventions and agreements. A second common theme for effective international organizations comes from the fact that there are enforceable standards. Mm-hmm. Because if you want to talk about whether it is civil aviation or maritime activities, if you're interested in safety, what is the standard? And can you enforce upon those standards? If you want to talk about the emissions, well, how do you measure? And can there be agreement on the standards that we will observe, and then what are the enforcement mechanisms? So that is another very important aspect. And I think there's another third aspect, at least, that makes these organizations effective, and that is the idea that they have to go through sustained evolution. They cannot be static. They have to keep, updating themselves, reinventing themselves. If you think about civil aviation, I think the first convention that came about, first protocol, was probably 1944. And it took them about 10 years before ICAO was born. So there was a Chicago protocol. And then years down the road, there was a Montreal protocol. And then further years down the road, there was a Tokyo protocol. In other words, as civil aviation progressed, the needs will change. And your protocols and your conventions have to be updated accordingly. So when we think about an international organization, an agency that has to be put together, it has to have that sort of long-range thinking, that it will not be a one-time exercise. You have to invest in the building blocks. You have to, in a way, encourage many of these international conversations, international consensus. They will take time to build up. But if you are heading in a particular direction that is clear and attractive to everyone, for example, agreeing that we will focus on safety, we will focus on environmental standards, I think that's one way in which we can arrive at a landscape that governs digital commons more effectively for the benefit of all of us.
Yes, thank you, Josephine. You both took out some points. I will follow up, but I saw that Florian here, so I will continue after your statement, please.
And I was just listening, and I think the point on enforcement is really important. When I look at cyber, I would say we are pretty good in regulating, but on enforcing consequences, I would say we could become much better. Yeah? We have already good platforms in exchanging and nurturing these and explaining ourselves to the citizens, but actually in enforcing the consequences of not adhering to these, that we must become even more effective. And one other point, I think what we see is our economies fundamentally change from becoming resource industries to data-driven economies. And data-driven economies is a trust business. Yeah? So, and if one in this group loses the trust, it might infect the trust of all others. So if there's one large hyperscaler out there that for some reason loses his master key to his own cloud, to some government, yeah, you feel insecure of using any cloud out there because it could happen maybe to. So how do you enforce the consequences? And I think that's important in this trust area, that we could become much more outspoken here.
Yes, thank you. I would like to follow up on what Amandeep a little bit touched upon on AI and AI governance. As the AI advisory body will come out with some proposals, but some proposals have been already proposed, such as the Global AI Agency, and it has been considered, but has also been heavily criticized as it may not deliver in this situation where actually countries are at very different levels. We have countries with 20% of internet penetration. We have very big, powerful countries that China and US that will vote in a way for their interests, but also that it's not really comparable actually to these other developments that have also been brought out by the minister. Nuclear, that is a very slow-moving, expensive, still government-controlled area, whereas AI definitely is not. So, Urs, you have been studying this area quite extensively. What would be your take on such an agency or similar agency, and what could be the roles of this agency in this current situation?
Thank you. I would like to build upon the framework that you, Minister, offered with, there are steps and there is some sort of a sequencing how to think about effective international organizations, which I think makes a lot of sense looking also backwards. Now, as you, Nele, point out, AI, and that's the controversy, may be a different animal where we may not have the time to wait for 3 conventions over the next 50 years to develop. because then indeed we may be too late. And as we know, there have been calls to stop even the development of AI and put the moratorium in place. So I think we need to acknowledge there is a disagreement not only on what the norms ought to be at all the levels that you suggested, but certainly at the global level. And there is a disagreement how to get to such a shared understanding. And I think that's the dilemma that we're facing right now. In operational terms, and obviously that's also what is sketched as a process, it's important to start with consultations and really listen to the people and to the key stakeholders where they see the most pressing needs, particularly at this global level of guardrails. There have been obviously conversations going on, which you mentioned in the introduction, upon which one could build. Now, from my personal perspective, even if the shared set of norms we all agree globally may be a far-reaching goal right now, there's much we can do. I think you pointed out, or in the conversation it came up, that there's a fair amount of information asymmetry. So between the private sector, who may know much more about the promise and also the limitations of the technologies, not only that we see today being rolled out of the lab, but actually the ones that are developed and will come out of the lab in 3 to 5 years from now. And so how do we think about the information asymmetry between public leaders and decision makers, citizens, and the private sector? Or think about information asymmetries between the majority world countries with ministries that may be less well resourced and governments who understand AI is important but may not have a good sense yet what are evolving, emerging good practices, or what is actually the thing, the priorities we need to worry about or embrace on the opportunity side. And so you could see that a sort of a global clearinghouse can make a lot of sense, where it becomes easier to actually synthesize information, to collect information from different stakeholders, and to facilitate information exchanges. And I think there is precedent too. At the national level, how such clearing houses could look like, how governments, but also academia and industry can play a really productive role. Another area, just to add one more, where I see the time is here to act, is when it comes to cooperation and collaboration. Some AI issues, and you mentioned environmental impact as an example, Minister, there are coalitions of actors who want to move forward in a productive direction. And you could see that such a global forum can support and leverage and facilitate such efforts. You could also see, even to be ambitious, that you could set up a global prize or award or create new funds to encourage innovation using the full range of tools available in the governance toolbox to steer innovation in directions that are globally accepted. So while I agree we may be far away from having global norm consensus, leaving alone enforceable rules, there's much we can and probably must do so that we also train our muscles collectively at the global level. How can we use these technologies for the benefit of societies, of the planet, because make no mistake, we need the best technology available to deal with the big societal challenges of our time. And I'm not sure we can just wait.
So we have statements from Amadep reacting on Ur's proposals and then industry, and then I have the very final easy question.
Right. I think I just wanted to come back to this point of, it's not only about whether you're 20% connected or 90% connected. This is something that matters for all of humanity. Sometimes we have to be careful. Look back at the social media revolution. Everyone thought this is for democracy, human rights, open societies. Later on, we learned, no. There could be, some. So it could be that AI's impact in more developed economies may be more disruptive than its impact because of the nature of the knowledge economy, the kind of jobs you have. So I think it's a conversation regardless of development levels. Data can come from anywhere, and data that's really precious is not just that is personal data that's going through the platforms, the big platforms. It's genomics data, it's other kinds of data, industrial data, as Commissioner Breton was mentioning in the morning. So I think this is really a global issue in terms of both the risks and the opportunities. The point that Urs was making, that's fundamental. If there is a model to be developed for better catalytic converters, let's say catalytic efficiency, it's not good for the planet if it is being developed in 50 different places. We are using, compute resource, energy resource like that. So if there is global collaboration, which is underpinned by shared global norms, and we don't have to use the tools of yesterday, we don't have to wait for 20 years for treaties to be made. So if there are shared norms of governance, then that work can be done in one or two places for the common good. Provided we are open, we are using a truly commons approach. So we have to think beyond the existing tool set as we go forward with AI governance.
It's almost a final statement. I would say what you can take from here is we need regulation to create markets. It's very important to have a targeted, a precise, precision regulation that looks at the use case, because technology comes so complicated. And with this, I would say governments need to invest more in the ability to explore and embrace new technologies. Open it for your own organizations to see the art of the possible. When we talk with CEOs around the world, they say 40% of their workforce is not right skilled. Yeah. I don't know how much the rate might be in government, but I would say it might be even higher. Yeah. We have to work on this. We as IBM, we made a promise. We said we will train 10 million people around the world in 10 years. Because, so we open up our own education systems because we need the understanding of technology out there. This will not only nurture the acceptance, but this will also help actually that we will find the right talents for the future. And I think this is also important. So regulation also comes with an obligation.
Thank you. And final remarks for the minister, and then now our time is up.
Well, I agree there's some sense of urgency that we must have in the pursuit of greater cooperation. And I'm also cautiously optimistic that there are some very valuable building blocks that are being developed. I mean, if you take an issue, not necessarily AI, but if you take a problem that many of our societies face, and that is a problem of ransomware. There is now an international coalition of like-minded countries trying to counter the effects of ransomware. And this exercise is also demonstrating, how we can make progress in a way that is more satisfactory. It shows us that we can take a targeted yet comprehensive approach, targeting a particular topic, in this case ransomware, but being very comprehensive, looking at the whole issue end to end, from what is the taxonomy for describing ransomware, how do you develop a common language to discuss the issue, how do you stop the money from getting out of the financial system. So a targeted yet comprehensive approach helps. The other aspect, I think, is the fact that we want to move on common rules that we can all subscribe to. And again, just using ransomware as an example, very important if one jurisdiction has identified this ransom monies, the ability to stop it must also cross borders so that in another jurisdiction, the money does not leak out. Mm-hmm. So finding an interoperable way, common rules, and people being willing to subscribe to it. That's also another very important feature. Thirdly, I would say that in terms of membership of these kinds of initiatives, I think we have to be practical. Sometimes the like-minded countries start with a small number, and then you make progress and other people see that you're doing things that they can also subscribe to. And in this particular instance, it started only with about 20 countries. But it has a very inclusive membership, and by now that's more than doubled. So I would say that these are good examples of building blocks within ASEAN, whether it is in terms of data management, in terms of a digital economy agreement, or as our next step, to put together a guide on AI that will help us all to start thinking about what are the common principles that we will want to adopt in our respective countries. Those are the ways that we can strengthen the building blocks and in time to come, create the conditions for really effective global governance of AI.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining for this very important topic. Even though that it's, I would say, not yet popularized, and there is not so much awareness actually about all these different processes that are ongoing that actually will impact every single person in this room and beyond. So I am glad that we have perhaps made one step towards increasing this understanding of these essential processes. And I do hope that we will find a common agreement on some principles that we will adhere to. And thank you so much.